just days after President Donald Trump assumed office in January 2025. The global economic landscape was jolted by a sudden and aggressive maneuver: the immediate imposition of sweeping tariffs on a wide range of imported goods from the United States' key trade partners. With the ink barely dry on the oath of office, the newly inaugurated president executed one of his administration's first acts of economic nationalism, announcing tariffs that reached across the Atlantic and Pacific, targeting goods from China, the European Union, Mexico, and Canada. The announcement echoed campaign promises centered around putting America first, but the speed and scale of the policy sent shockwaves through markets, industries, and political institutions alike. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The tariffs, ranging from 15% to 35% on categories including steel, automobiles, electronics, and agricultural products, were rolled out without the usual diplomatic overtures or economic negotiations. Businesses that relied on global supply chains, especially manufacturers, were caught off guard. Investors reacted almost instantly. Global markets dipped sharply, and domestic stocks in sectors like automotive manufacturing, agriculture, and tech were particularly hard hit. Within hours, foreign leaders issued statements condemning the tariffs as reckless, economically dangerous, and a violation of trade norms. Meanwhile, the World Trade Organization expressed concern over what it described as a destabilizing move that could disrupt years of delicate economic cooperation. However, the backlash wasn't only international. In Washington, D.C., the sudden imposition of tariffs triggered a legal and constitutional firestorm. While executive authority on trade matters is substantial, the Trump administration's decision to act without consulting Congress or engaging in a formal review process ignited fierce debate. Lawmakers from both major parties expressed concern over what many saw as an overreach of executive power. Trade policy, although often shaped by the president, still requires adherence to statutory limits and procedural norms, many of which were bypassed in the administration's push to make a bold first impression. Multiple lawsuits were filed within days, challenging the legality of the tariffs on the grounds that they were enacted unilaterally and without congressional oversight. Key among these was a suit that quickly rose to national prominence. A coalition of U.S. manufacturers, agriculture trade groups, and bipartisan lawmakers joined forces to ask the Supreme Court for an emergency injunction. Their argument was grounded not only in economic concerns, but in constitutional principles. The plaintiffs contended that the president had violated the separation of powers by unilaterally imposing taxes, tariffs being, in essence, a tax on imported goods, without the approval of Congress, which holds the exclusive power of the purse. While the legal battle intensified, the economic consequences continued to spiral. American farmers, many of whom had struggled during earlier trade wars, saw international contracts abruptly canceled. Shipments of U.S. soybeans, pork, and corn were turned away at foreign ports as retaliatory tariffs were imposed by trading partners. In the tech sector, companies dependent on components manufactured abroad faced immediate cost increases and production delays. The automotive industry, reliant on globally integrated supply chains, began projecting layoffs and halts in production lines. Retailers, too, warned of price increases as consumer goods from abroad suddenly carried inflated costs. Despite mounting domestic pressure, the Trump administration remained defiant in its messaging. Officials argued that the tariffs were essential to correcting long-standing trade imbalances and bringing manufacturing jobs back to American soil. The administration framed the decision as a bold reassertion of national sovereignty in the face of what it portrayed as decades of economic exploitation by foreign powers. But the White House's assurances did little to calm the outrage. Governors of export-heavy states joined the opposition, citing the immediate harm to their constituents and local economies. What made this episode particularly explosive was the sheer speed at which it unraveled. Normally, trade policy changes take months or even years of negotiation and legal alignment. Instead, these tariffs had been implemented through a series of executive memoranda invoking national security justifications, a controversial legal strategy previously used during Trump's first term. Critics argued that invoking national security to justify tariffs on friendly nations like Canada or Germany was a blatant misuse of legal authority. Legal scholars questioned whether the administration had exceeded even the generous latitude granted to the executive branch in matters of trade. Amid growing tension, the Supreme Court shocked the nation by agreeing to hear the case on an expedited basis. The justices recognized the far-reaching implications of the case, not only for the economy, but for the constitutional balance of power. Oral arguments were heard less than 2 weeks after the announcement of the tariffs. The courtroom was filled with legal teams, press, and representatives from affected industries. Though the ideological divide of the court loomed large in the background, the gravity of the constitutional questions appeared to cut across usual partisan lines. After only a few days of deliberation, the Supreme Court issued a ruling that reverberated through every branch of government. The tariffs were to be suspended immediately. In a clear majority opinion, the court ruled that the executive branch had exceeded its authority by imposing what amounted to a sweeping tax policy without congressional involvement. The court acknowledged the president's latitude in protecting national interests, but underscored that such powers must still operate within the framework of constitutional limits. The ruling made it clear that even under the guise of national security, executive action could not replace legislative authority, especially when economic policy with massive domestic and international ramifications was at stake. The decision triggered immediate celebration among trade groups and economic sectors that had been under siege since the tariffs were announced. Supply chain managers, exporters, and importers scrambled to reverse course. Still, the damage inflicted during the short life of the tariffs remained. Canceled contracts, interrupted shipments, stock price fluctuations, and diplomatic friction could not be undone with a gavel strike. Nonetheless, the ruling represented a powerful check on executive power and a reaffirmation of the foundational principle that major economic decisions, particularly those affecting millions of livelihoods, must be subjected to oversight and due process. The implications of the ruling stretched far beyond the legal technicalities of trade authority. It marked a moment of institutional assertion by the judiciary, signaling to the executive branch that even the most powerful office in the land must operate within established boundaries. It also re-energized congressional efforts to reassert control over trade policy. Bipartisan lawmakers began drafting new legislation aimed at tightening the language of trade statutes, particularly Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which had long provided presidents with latitude to enact tariffs on the grounds of national security. Internationally, the court's intervention was seen as both a relief and a reminder of the resilience of American democratic institutions. While foreign governments expressed frustration over the initial decision, many welcomed the ruling as a sign that the United States remained tethered to rule of law principles, even amid the turbulence of populist political shifts. Diplomats began informal discussions about restoring trade relationships and preventing further escalations. The immediate cessation of tariffs helped avert the threat of a full-scale trade war. Though some diplomatic damage had already been done, the political ramifications were equally intense. Within the U.S., the ruling emboldened critics of the Trump administration, many of whom had warned that his approach to governance would inevitably clash with constitutional constraints. The ruling provided a rallying point for opposition leaders, who argued that competence and adherence to legal norms were indispensable qualities in a functioning presidency. Supporters of the administration, on the other hand, viewed the decision as a setback for efforts to revitalize domestic industry and reduce dependency on foreign economies. Nonetheless, even many within Trump's own party expressed concern over the strategy of imposing such a sweeping policy without proper channels. The decision also sparked renewed interest in the judicial role in preserving economic stability. For years, courts had largely deferred to the executive in matters of trade, especially when national security was invoked. This ruling marked a departure, a judicial insistence that not all actions justified under vague language could be allowed to proceed unchecked. It opened the door for future litigation over executive action, potentially altering the calculus for presidents who might seek to use broad legal justifications to implement far-reaching economic policies. From a governance perspective, the ruling underscored the importance of process, deliberation, and institutional balance. While the administration had acted with swiftness and confidence, the lack of consultation, planning, and consensus ultimately undermined its initiative. The judiciary's rebuke made clear that even urgent political objectives must be pursued within the constitutional framework. It served as a reminder that in the United States, the strength of any policy lies not only in its intent, but in its legal foundation. Economically, the short-lived tariffs exposed the fragility of global trade interdependence, the disruption to supply chains, the volatility in markets, and the reactions from trade partners all revealed just how deeply interconnected the world's economies had become. Attempts to sever or dramatically alter those connections overnight produced real consequences, not only in boardrooms but on farms, in factories, and in shipping yards. The episode reignited debates about globalization, economic nationalism, and the proper tools for addressing trade imbalances without courting economic chaos. Even though the tariffs were halted, the broader questions they raised lingered. What is the right balance between protecting domestic industry and engaging in free trade? How can democratic systems ensure that urgent political goals do not override constitutional checks? And how should the U.S. navigate an increasingly competitive global economy while maintaining internal cohesion and legal fidelity? While the immediate crisis passed with the Supreme Court's ruling, the event left a lasting imprint on the nation's political, legal, and economic consciousness. It reinforced the idea that power must always be balanced with responsibility, and that even the most ambitious policy agendas must pass through the crucible of constitutional scrutiny. The tariffs episode became a case study in the limits of unilateral governance, a high-stakes reminder that in a democracy, every decision, no matter how bold, must honor the institutions that sustain it. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us. What are your thoughts on Trump's tariffs? What do you expect happens next? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.